deal first with the brand issues. The researchers showed limited enthusiasm for buying legal services from non-legal brands, and also that a great majority of consumers are unable to identify any existing legal brands. And I think I'd invite views as to why consumers don't recognise legal brands and how we think we can change this.
The market's too differentiated, and individual providers of legal services tend to want to promote their own brands. There are, as we know, particularly in solicitors' firms, some well-known brands. We need to ask the question why they are not better known for the ultimate consumer.
I think there's a point that actually in brand development and brand promotion, a lot of firms haven't spent the serious money and investment needed to develop that. I mean, certainly when you see things like the FT survey of the 500 top brands, I mean, about the 3 law firms that appear are all in the second half of that. So that even when you do surveys, not just of the retail consumer, but of the corporate consumer, you get very little unprompted brand recognition. So, I mean, I take your point that people weren't wildly enthusiastic with non-legal brands, but there's clearly no real stickiness for legal brands either at the moment.
But are those people who are selling themselves as new entrants, excuse me, as new entrants to the market, can be branding themselves as lawyers, or are they going to be branding themselves through a traditional brand that might mean something else? I think the question that you asked beforehand about why there's a lack of real identifiable legal brand is like quite as simple as this. When you go to your supermarket, do you have a choice of 8,000 types of toothpaste? You don't, but at the moment there are 8,000 law firms out there who are competing for work.
Sometimes we get too hung up on the issue of brand. I think one of the things that comes out from the survey that I was very interested in was to see that actually consumers don't seem tied to big brand names as much as perhaps the perception might be that they would be. And I think the supermarket kind of image on branding can be a bit of a misnomer, because actually the supermarket is just an enveloping brand tied around 50,000 other brands that it in fact puts a roof over and that it sells. So is Heinz a bigger brand than Tesco's? Question mark, I don't know, and so on, but it's Tesco's that sells Heinz. And so I do think there's some nuance to it. I also feel that individuals, what are they looking for in terms of the tie-up for the brand, in terms of the purchase of legal services is most often a distressed purchase outside the corporate world and so on. So the concept of trying to relate it to, for instance, a retail brand with which a customer would have interaction with almost on a daily basis, I think sometimes it's kind of overstated.
I don't think it's necessarily the case that one will require a massive budget in order to get brand recognition, because I think organisations like Quality Solicitors are doing it through a very different way of being visible on the high street and having a notable brand.
There's certain jobs we do which have now become so commoditised and almost process driven, which you can almost put in a box, can't you? You can literally put wills to a certain point in the box, and I would argue the same in terms of the way PI work has been commoditised, particularly road traffic work, for instance, whether we like it or not, I suppose. But I think the real challenge is obviously how far those organisations who, like you've said actually, behind the scenes to some extent, who aren't law firms, are going to see this as a market which is profitable.
I can't speak for solicitors because I work in the world of barristers, and I can tell you that there are 350 barristers' chambers in the country, and if you were to look at their websites and blank out their names, you wouldn't know one from the other. So they're absolutely undifferentiated, and they are, you may tell me solicitors are worse, but they are, from my own personal experience, the worst people at making themselves known and familiar with their client base. That is solicitors.
And I think what was one of the very interesting things coming out of this was the apparent wish to both have a fee certainty but also a personal contact. And I think a lot of lawyers' firms say, well, actually that's great, that's our model and everything else. I think actually what's very interesting, we were doing a survey a few weeks ago of law firms and their accessibility, and the vast majority were 9 to 5, closed for lunch. And you said, well, if I'm wanting personal contact, if I've got to take half a day off work to see my lawyer, it's not going to happen.
I think if you actually asked someone the same questions who are at that point wanting legal services, they're not interested in quality, they're interested in two things: how much, how quick.
But don't you think there's a theme running through the kind of retail market that we're in from a legal services point of view in terms of customer service issues? One thing we're bad at, and you have to look at the kind of complaints profile, it's not so much technical legal advice, it's the manner in which the advice is given. And if you look at the sort of US experience in terms of the legal marketplace, they're actually using the customer experience as being the main determinant really of quality. And we don't talk about customers, we talk about clients generally. I mean, that, you have to only look at the report actually, and a lot of the literature. And I think that's where the real sort of hard work.
Jeff, I don't disagree at all. I mean, I saw very early on when we acquired a call centre that many of the people in the call centre are far better at dealing with people than our solicitors are by a massive factor.
Same here.
I wouldn't let a solicitor anywhere near a client.
And in terms of brand, I'm not convinced that it will be easy to set a sort of a legal firm up. It is a brand that says that you can get all these things from this firm, and that would be the best source of
that's
legal
why they're
services.
probably
You're right. I mean, the brand is, it's a promise, and it's a promise of a consistent thing. You buy a Mars bar because you knew what the last one was like, and you know this one will be the same.
One of the things with looking forward with the Legal Services Act is that the position of the high street solicitor is seen to be in sort of grave danger, and the perception is that consumers are going to be faced with a number of brands or offerings which they can choose from depending on which products they want to buy, but that one of the places which they won't be able to buy from is the high street solicitor. And I just wondered what your thoughts are as to the likely continued existence of that kind of business organisation.
A lot of clients that are traditional high street firms that do incredibly well, and not just because they work with me, and obviously take some credit for that, because they communicate with their clients, they take time to explain what they do for them, they keep in touch with them afterwards, all the things that you see in surveys that solicitors are renowned not for doing, the basics that we should all do in our businesses.
What you're overlooking is the economy and the scale issue here. I mean, yes, it is technically possible for the high street solicitor to reinvent himself as a patisserie rather than a bakery, but you've got to have a patisserie demand in the neighbourhood, and there isn't that in most high streets. The main problem they have is lack of power.
My experience is a lot of lawyers are just lazy. They'll just buy cases, particularly in the PI marketplace. And there's a great sort of small business guru in the States called Seth Godin. I don't know if anybody's heard about him around the state, but he talks about small being effectively the new way of working actually. And I think he's right, because we're seeing already, aren't we, small businesses or medium-sized businesses challenging some of the bigger businesses.
Are people persuaded that the quality solicitors branded branches model that was kind of, unveiled last week? I know Nick's doing the loyalty law kind of similar, well not similar, but aimed at high streets. I know you probably point out lots of differences. But is that, do you think that's for the consumer? Do you think that's a tempting, I'm sure it's not a tempting prospect, but do you think that's kind of, does that work as a way of accessing legal services?
It can work, I think. It's saying something about the quality of the experience that one can expect going through the door, but it won't work unless the actual experience meets the name. So there has to be that consistency between what's promised and what's actually delivered, where I think the real work has to start.
I just think it's rebranding something that doesn't work. So it's a sticking plaster to really try and deal with a severed artery.
I think it's very unlawyer-like. It's audacious, it's bold. I think it challenges the status quo and should be hugely applauded. And if it stops the profession having an obsession with talking to itself and actually talking to its clients, then great.
You think it's challenging the status quo, isn't it? Just
I think it's propping it up.
in the report there were negative associations with the title solicitor. And do you think that the title solicitor holds any value in the consumer law?
What's even more worrying was that it appeared 48% of those comments were unprintable, but they were just described as strongly negative, which...
I think this is a really interesting point, because if there is no positive connotation to the brand solicitor, if I can call it that for the moment, and apart from those services which are reserved to solicitors, what is the value to, say, the high street solicitor in continuing to call themselves solicitor, having to pay all the fees they have to pay, to be regulated and to satisfy the compliance obligations of that regulation? Wouldn't they be better abandoning that title and, provided they're not doing reserved services through that organisation, continue to operate as lawyers or legal providers or under some other title?
Unless we as a group of lawyers, that's widening lawyers quite considerably beyond solicitors and barristers, accept that we may need to redefine the protected species to be lawyer and get protection for the brand lawyer and set therefore certain minimum qualification standards, that we will actually slowly see a diminution in the importance of the words, because the word solicitor is certainly increasingly falling into disuse, and the word lawyer is synonymous with the word barrister in my opinion.
Isn't that I mean, it is our thought that, but you look at, I mean, that sounds horribly a protectionism phrase. You know, I advised a young girl who got a very good degree, law degree, and looked like they've gotten distinctions at the College of Law and things like that. Not got one single interview out of several hundred applications for jobs. And I start looking at it and thinking, crikey, you know, on the basis of this, I personally would never have got a job, and yet now I'm managing a law firm. Now, what's going on there?